What I've tried to do, and others in our group have tried to do, is to be very visible on pro-Palestinian protests so that when the mainstream media cover them, they can't help but point out that there are not only Jewish protesters there, but also descendants and actual Holocaust survivors there.
Before we begin, I want to say something about why this conversation matters and why it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. Mark Etkind is not someone who approaches politics from abstraction or ideology. He comes out of lived history. He's the son of a Holocaust survivor, someone who endured the Łódź Ghetto and multiple concentration camps, including Buchenwald. That inheritance is formative. And it's the reason that Mark has become one of the co-organizers of Holocaust Survivors and Descendants Against the Gaza Genocide, a group that has made itself deeply unwelcome in polite political space. Mark is often accused of crossing a line, of drawing parallels that, at least according to his critics, should never be drawn, of trivializing the Holocaust by invoking it in the context of Gaza. These accusations are not marginal. They come from established Jewish institutions, from pro-Israel commentators, from people who insist that Holocaust memory must remain sealed off of present-day politics. Mark rejects that premise entirely. He argues that remembrance without consequence is hollow, that repeating never again, while averting one's eyes from contemporary mass violence, turns memory into ritual and ritual into moral cover. When the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust marked remembrance without reference to Gaza, Mark didn't see neutrality. He saw evasion. And he said so publicly, knowing exactly how that would land. What makes this conversation difficult and necessary is that Mark isn't arguing from denial or minimization. He's arguing from continuity, from warning signs, from the conviction that the point of Holocaust memory is not veneration of the past, but prevention in the present, even when that implicates states aligned with Western power. He has accused Western leaders of a particular kind of hypocrisy, invoking the Holocaust as moral capital, by refusing to confront atrocities carried out by their allies. That accusation makes people angry because it collapses the distance between then and now. So this is not an easy conversation. It's not meant to be. But if Holocaust remembrance means anything beyond ceremony, then voices like Mark Etkind cannot simply be dismissed. Mark Etkind, pleasure having you here in the Palestine House in London. How are you?
I'm okay. It's a bit cold in here, but we're okay.
It's true. Yeah, we had the same issue yesterday. Mark, to set the stage, we were in contact for a while and you were kind enough to arrange virtually a string of interviews for me here in London. Today is day 2 of my week here and you are the second interview. Now, we will come to your background. But first, I would like to set the stage with a little bit of context. I have interviewed 2 survivors of the 1948 massacre in Tantura. Both of them coincidentally have died within the last 3 months. So there was a lady in Amman, which I interviewed, and a gentleman in Germany. Now, when I published those interviews, they had a moderate view from 12,000–15,000 views per interview. And then via a string of coincidences, I came into contact with the daughter of a former Israeli soldier who participated in the attacks of Tantura. And within a week, I think this interview had more than 120,000 views. Now, what I want to say with this is, voices like yours and the voices of the people that you arranged me to speak with have a great impact. And I choose my words carefully, great or greater impact for whatever reasons, because of your background. So again, the comparison, Palestinian victims themselves had like 10% of the views. The moment you have an Israeli voice, even a critical Israeli voice, discussing the more or less the same issue, it's like 10 times more. Okay? So that's why I think voices like yours and voices like the voices of the circle that that you're part of are extremely valuable. So thank you again for sitting here with me today and to have this discussion.
Thank you.
Now, what's your entry point in our discussion here? And this is also why I'm especially interested in talking to you, is that you are the son of a Holocaust. Now, I need to be mindful. Survivor or victim? I don't know which word better to choose.
Survivor is the word that the survivors prefer for obvious reasons. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, there are a couple of obvious questions, of course, yeah? But let's start maybe with you giving us a moderate introduction into your family history, maybe.
Well, my mother is not Jewish, was not a survivor, was born here. My father, however, was born in Poland in the 1920s, so he's 15 years old when the war starts, I think, certainly around that age. And within weeks of the Nazis invading Poland, he's pushed into the Łódź Ghetto. So this is an area of this big industrial town, Łódź, that was very run down. And that's where they pushed all the Jews into, out of the city of Łódź, which was now being incorporated into Greater Germany. This was the Nazi plan at the time. So they wanted to get rid of the Jews. They weren't quite sure where to put them at the time. So they pushed them into this area of the ghetto with poor sanitation and overcrowding, and of course without access to sufficient food. They deprived people there of many of their resources, certainly their businesses, money and such like, and people began to die in quite large numbers just because they didn't have the facilities to keep them alive. And there are many differences between what my father and his family went through in those early years of the war and what's been happening in Gaza. But there's also a very obvious similarity in that families, entire communities have just been pushed out of where they usually live into completely inadequate conditions. My father's story, if you want me to go on further, is that his father and his older brother left the Łódź Ghetto to try and make it over to the other side, either to the Polish nationalist side or to the Soviet side.
You have to clarify. What do you mean define left? They fled?
Yes, they tried to get. There were short periods where you could get out with some difficulty, but they didn't get far. They just ended up in another ghetto because the Nazis were putting all Jews into ghettos. They were trying to get to Warsaw, I think. And then that ghetto was cleared, as far as we know, in August 1942, and they were killed in Treblinka. Before this, my father, as I said, he's in the Łódź Ghetto with his mother and sister and younger brother, and within a year or a bit more, both his mother and his younger brother have died of disease and lack of food. And the conditions in the ghetto only get worse after that. So it's him and his sister left alone. And his sister eventually dies in the ghetto, although he's already left by then. So we're talking about, he's in the ghetto for those 4 years. People are dying all around him. They're being slowly but remorselessly starved to death under appalling conditions, deprived of medical care, water. There's clean water. The Gestapo and others are coming in to torture people in order to take whatever other resources they might have if they were hiding money or gold or something like this. So it's just a nightmarish, hellish situation. Many people say the ghettos were as bad as concentration camps in a way. I mean, in a concentration, some of the concentration camps, like the ones my father later ended up in, you were sort of there to work. Well, you were there to work, and so there was a reason to give you some food. In the ghettos, if you didn't have a job, you would just be starving. Of course, what happens in the Łódź Ghetto and other ghettos is people are cleared out and they're sent to be gassed in the gas chambers. My father survives by some miracle, mainly because he's young and has a bit of energy or whatever, and he's able to work in the Łódź Ghetto, and then he's sent out not to be gassed, but to become a slave laborer in various concentration camps. Czestochowa was one of these camps. He ends up in Buchenwald at some point, a very big camp, and then he ends up in smaller camps associated with German military factories towards the end of the war. And eventually the guards, the SS guards, don't want the Russians and others coming to them. They don't want them. So they march him around in what's called a death march in Germany itself. People again are dying all around him. The German soldiers, they don't want to shoot all their prisoners because then they've got nothing to do. And if you're a German soldier at the end of World War II with nothing to do, then other German soldiers will come and hang you for being a deserter. So you want to have a job, if you like. So these SS prisoners want to march their prisoners, SS guards want to march their prisoners around Germany, but don't quite know where they're going. Anyway, eventually, back in May 44, the American tank comes over the hill and my father is liberated.
Quite an ordeal. Out of interest, was your father able to discuss this with you to a certain extent?
Some Holocaust survivors are well known for never speaking to their families or anyone else about it. Other Holocaust survivors spoke about it all the time. My father was one who spoke about it all the time. So. And he wrote an autobiography and did other interviews and stuff, so I can go into an awful lot more detail about what he went through. He passed away 5 or 6 years ago now, so it's up to his family to pass it on in a way.
When did you, I mean, you personally, realize that there was something, I would say, extraordinary? I avoid the word special, but extraordinary, I think is the right word for it, that happened to your father? I mean, consciously? When did you realize that?
I think because he spoke about it openly, and it was my father's friends were often survivors themselves, so it was the atmosphere around the family was always like that. Obviously, it's only at a certain age you really consciously understand what happened. But I suppose something like 10, 11, that sort of age, when you really consciously know, partly because you watch documentaries on TV about the Holocaust, about the war, and my father would speak, and so you'd make that connection. But this is my generation, being a young child in the 60s, in England, is obsessed with World War II anyway, but it's just that my particular family World War II background is a little different from other English people that I was brought up with. Yeah.
Did your father, I'm following my own interest here now, yeah? Did your father ever talk about how he was received once he was liberated back into society?
Yes, in great detail. I mean, so firstly, the American soldiers who liberate him give him chocolates and cigarettes and other things, which is very dangerous. You don't want to have any kind of rich food just having been starved for years. So I think people he was with actually died at that stage because then, but he was a tough cookie, somehow managed to survive. He ends up in a Red Army hospital. I guess that's what you would describe it. So although it's the Americans that liberate him, because he ends up in what's now the Czech Republic, there aren't any borders at the time, and you could walk from one side to anyway. For whatever reason, he ends up on the Red Army side, and they look after him in a hospital. He almost dies, but he manages to recover. So he has some interesting stories about that. He ends up in a Red Army uniform. He witnesses how brutal the Red Army officers are to their own soldiers, and I think partly from that experience and other stories he hears about Stalin's Russia, although he's obviously grateful for the Red Army liberating the camps and defeating Hitler, he never had any illusions in Stalin's regime and how brutal it was. The story he told me is that if he had stayed on the Soviet side, it's quite likely he'd have ended up in the Gulag or similar prison conditions. Stalin didn't like people from the West who'd been in the camps being, he didn't trust anyone. So, I don't know how true that is, but it seems he made the right decision by then going over to the American side. Anyway, he ends up in Theresienstadt, which is a famous concentration camp, but it becomes then a displaced persons camp. And he breaks into that camp, if you can imagine such a thing, breaking into a concentration camp. I mean, it wasn't very difficult. He just climbed over the wall. But that meant that he now was in a situation where he was, fed or whatever, looked after in terrible conditions at the end of the war all across Europe. And he's just lucky to be in the right place at the right time when they're allowing children, not adults, but children, to come to Britain in small numbers, as long as Jewish philanthropists here in Britain will fund them. There's no generosity from Britain or America or anywhere else to take in Holocaust survivors at this point, but they will take in modest numbers, in the hundreds of children. Now, my father, at this point, he's 19 years old, so he's formally not really a child, but because he's relatively short and small, because he's been starved for all these years, and because he said he was a bit younger, he could then come into the country. And he was always very grateful, and quite rightly so, to Britain, because he was treated very well. And in stark contrast, I think, to the way Britain is treating refugees now, he was treated extremely well. He ended up in the Lake District, in a former factory, I think, with a whole bunch of other sons and daughters, mostly sons of, not sons, daughters, mostly boys and girls, mostly young survivors in this area, and they were taught English, and then he got an education and became an architect in the end. So he is a success story for integration and success, and Britain is a haven for such things and should be really proud of this tradition of people coming here and making lives for themselves. Tragically, we have a political class now that aren't particularly proud of that anymore, don't want to continue that tradition. They will put certain immigrants from that generation on a pedestal, but they're very reluctant to continue that tradition nowadays if you come over. And I think it's very depressing and very worrying.
I think you just said you just said something important. Not before the Second World War, not during the Second World War, and also not after the Second World War, were any of the European or Western countries, inclusive the United States and the United Kingdom, very eager to receive Jewish people and survivors, right? So on the contrary, they did everything they could in order to kind of prevent this from happening, especially the Jews from Russia. When I interviewed Noam Chomsky, I had twice the pleasure talking to him. He told me something that I had to think about for 3 seconds. He said the very existence of Israel is the epitome of racism. Or no, I think he said anti-Semitism. So I had to swallow for a second before I realized what they actually meant. Yeah, of course. They created Israel in order to avoid the Jews going in the other Western countries, which basically all closed their borders, knowing fully well that millions are being killed whilst they're doing so, right? So from your perspective, and this is an angle that I really would like to explore, it would have been very easy to follow the mainstream narrative in regards to Israel, the most moral army in the world, a land without people for a people without land. Brilliant slogans, I keep saying, yeah. But you didn't. So I'm really interested to explore how that came to be, and how was it for your father? What was his view vis-a-vis Israel and what happened in Israel? Because when you said he died 6 years ago, that means he had 70 years, to look back at what happened in Israel. No?
That's a lot of questions. Yes. So like many of his generation of Jewish people, they, in England and other Western countries, America and elsewhere, they would not consider themselves to be Zionists in the full sense, because the Zionist is someone who wanted to and went to live in Israel. My father made a decision never to do that.
Well, you have Zionists everywhere. They're not necessarily living in Israel. Yeah, you have Christian Zionists in America. Noam Chomsky told me about 60 million of them. Yeah. So yes, that's true, but
I'm just saying that one way of looking at the word Zionist is if you're Jewish and a Zionist, you go to live in Israel. To be a Zionist and not to live in Israel, just to support Israel abstractly, is not really being a Zionist. So the point I'm simply making is that he never seriously considered going to live in Israel. Every Jew of his generation gave it some consideration, of course, because there was a lot of persuasive propaganda, if you like, saying this was the thing to do, and he made his own decision not to do that. I looked into a bit of the history of this. He wasn't aware of it at the time, because he was lucky enough to be flown to Britain in the summer of 1945. But when the Zionist movement found out about young Jews being flown to Britain, they didn't like this idea because they wanted this young, good human material, I think might be the right sort of phrase they used, these people to go to Palestine. And there was an attempt, which I think, from what I've read, was successful by the Zionist movement. And I don't just mean Ben Gurion and the establishment. I mean Holocaust survivors within the displaced people's camps, also that supported Israel, also didn't want this to happen. They wanted Jews to all go to one place because the general atmosphere within quite a short time, certainly in the years after World War II, is that other ways of dealing with the issue of Jews had all seemed to fail. The idea of integrating, the idea of being part perhaps of even of a socialist society or some other more progressive form, which was very popular to many Jews before the war. There was a very large Jewish socialist movement of many varieties before the war, but in Israel. But there was the Bund in Eastern Europe. Many Jews supported the communist parties or supported other movements, and they wanted very much to be part of European or perhaps American society or Western societies. The Holocaust, I think, taught people a lesson, was Jews have to look after themselves and have this national refuge. So even if you weren't a Zionist in the sense of wanting to go to live there, even if it wasn't the priority in your life, having that as a background, as a means of escape, seemed quite important. So Zionism, there's many reasons why it became popular amongst Jews, but I think one of them was just this disillusion with the idea of integration, of the idea that you could just live in Europe, either in a more liberal democracy or a socialist society. All those hopes were marred, if you like. And so I think the general atmosphere was, even if you didn't want to go to live in Israel, you were going to give it some support. But my understanding is that in the 50s, and also even in the 60s, this was always rather secondary. It wasn't even that much of a priority in the Jewish community. It isn't until 67 and the 70s that this way in which being strongly in favor of Israel became almost a priority amongst Jewish community, in the Jewish community. Now, my father was very much an independent thinker. To what extent he was influenced by what the wider Jewish community was saying or doing, I'm not so sure. But living here in England, the BBC and the British political establishment have much more influence on most people, including most Jewish people. And what you got from the BBC in those days, I'm thinking when I was first listening to the BBC as a kid in the 60s and 70s, was very strong pro-Israel line, even stronger than it is today. Palestinians were just Arabs and they were just enemies and they weren't even considered to have any rights. It was all about, I think, my memory of the way the BBC radio would cover Israel-Palestine issue in the 70s, it was just always very pro-Israel. So to what extent you would say it was the Jewish community leadership, the Zionist movement influencing Jewish people? I think if the BBC, if the establishment as a whole are pushing in that direction, of course people are just going to accept it as the way to look at things. As a son of my father, of a Holocaust survivor, I'm looking at things in those ways. But also, we're talking about the 1970s, which was quite a time of radical left-wing politics, very fashionable amongst younger people, also into the early 80s as well, very much part of the music culture and stuff. So being critical of Israel was in the air of the way young people were thinking, but it wasn't, to be honest, very coherent in most of our thoughts, certainly not in my, until the Lebanon War in 1982. And the Sabra Shatila massacre, which took place within that war. And this is when the Israelis allow and encourage and let happen this horrible massacre by Christian phalangists of mostly women and children. I think hundreds, thousands, I don't know, I forget the figures now.
6,000, the varying figures, but
there are all sorts of debates about it. But this was a big shock to the left, to the Jewish community all around the world, and certainly to myself, realizing that I really had to rethink and try to understand what has been happening. And so we've already mentioned Chomsky. He's one person amongst others that I would read in order to try to grapple with this. And then me and my father would debate these issues in the way that young men and their fathers do in this time. There wasn't quite, this is the early 80s, so there wasn't kind of a generation gap in the way you had in the 60s and 70s, but it was still that kind of, there was a real cultural difference between those who'd come through the war and those who were teenagers into rock and roll and music and culture. There was a culture gap between me and my father, and between my generation, their parents, and differences of opinion around Palestine. Israel was one of the many things we would debate and argue about. We never fell out. We always loved each other, but it's just a normal father-son thing. And my father if I gave him the right sort of article, say written by a Jewish person, talking about the contradictions of what was happening in Israel, he'd find it fascinating, from a very critical point. He was open-minded, but when you come from a background of the Holocaust, which it's not just the horror and the suffering and the deaths, it's hard to describe. Okay, I'll give you an example from my father's experiences. When he was in a concentration camp, I think Częstochowa, he was in this Jewish community, if you like, surrounded by sadistic German guards. And then they had to go for delousing, which was outside the camp. So they marched through the streets of a Polish city during the war, which, is going to be relatively impoverished and have many issues with it. But to him, this was like going into the real world. This was like luxury. He was seeing this, face to face. And he saw a big poster of the evil, supposedly evil Jews controlling the world, one of these disgusting posters the Nazis would put up. And he can recall, he saw this poster, and then he went to be put in this swimming pool full of chemicals or whatever to delouse him. And then they walked back, not dried out, just bedraggled and damp, back to the camp. And of course the lice are there, which he brought him anyway. It doesn't make much difference to being, and the lice are very dangerous. They give you diseases, and it's a huge problem in the camps having this sort of situation. But he talks about how feeling in this utterly bedraggled way, seeing this poster, there was a part of him that almost believed the Nazi propaganda. We were the lowest people on the planet. We were responsible for all the problems in the world. He didn't use that language, but you can imagine if you can dehumanize people so much, and you can make them feel so isolated from the world, because when you're in the concentration camps in Central Europe at the height of World War II, the world is the Nazi regime. I mean, okay, you have some idea, there's America, there's Russia out there, but this is, the whole of Europe was blaming Jewish people, even children, even, old people, for all the problems in the world. At some level, there's a part of you that doesn't quite, obviously it's nonsense, doesn't believe it, but you'd feel utterly terrible and dehumanized. And I've forgotten quite why I'm bringing up this issue here, but it's that sense, if you live in a culture which is telling you you're the worst person in the world, when after the war, there's a Jewish project to build a safe haven for Jews, and other people are criticizing that project, I feel it's very difficult to break out of that mindset of being very defensive about that Jewish project. Does that make any sense of what I'm trying to say?
It makes total sense.
Okay.
It makes absolute sense.
To be blamed, and as I said, it was not, of course, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting my father thought he was what the Nazi propaganda machine said he was, because when he went to Buchenwald, this was another strange story that he told me many times. Buchenwald, the majority of people in Buchenwald, this very famous big camp, were not Jewish. And he'd been in the camp and the ghetto system at that point, 44, for over 4 years. So he was an old timer. He knew how to survive. He was a tough little young man. American soldiers were in the camp. Other
Gypsies.
soldiers, everywhere, people from Holland, from all of Denmark, all over were in the camp. He realized he was more sussed, more used to surviving in these appalling conditions than many other people. He could also see that it wasn't just the Jews that the Nazis were persecuting, it was the whole of Europe. They were at war with the world, if you like. And although the regime in Buchenwald kind of would have put Jews below others in a way, from the Nazi point of view, from his point of view, he was more experienced. He knew what, he realized that he was just human. So the strange thing about being in Buchenwald is it enlightened him about the nature of the Holocaust. It wasn't just this sort of Jewish thing. And of course, Buchenwald's an interesting case because it was actually run by the communists, Red Army soldiers, and German communists. They had a sort of internal regime, and he actually witnessed the way they would treat collaborators. So during the war, you would get in ghettos, or certainly in the camps, the Allies would do things like drop fake currency in order to disrupt the German economy, and sometimes someone would grab that, and of course it was, if you did that, you would be shot, and you weren't allowed to do such things. So if you were the sort of collaborator who would tell the SS guard, this person grabbed some money, this person did something illegal, that person would be shot, collaborators would then get extra bits of bread. So they were always collaborators in the camps. But when you went to Buchenwald, there was a system whereby the Communist and Red Army underground within the camp would then ask, who are the collaborators? Those collaborators would have a trial, and they'd then be murdered. And my father witnessed that within the camp system. Brutal. I mean, the guy was thrown up and down and thrown down until he died. Horrible. But this is how most communities deal with collaborators under appalling circumstances. We see in Gaza, it's absolutely horrible, but the way Hamas will deal with collaborators, it's very brutal. But this is the kind of brutality that my father witnessed at every level in the camps. And as I said, the point I think I'm trying to make is that this is not just a Nazi Germany versus Jewish thing. He realized, because he'd been in mostly Jewish camps, he suddenly realized, oh my God, the Nazis are at war with the whole world. And the whole world, hopefully, is a war with them. And then eventually, of course, the Nazis get defeated. So,
I think you said something really important. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a survivor of the Holocaust, then I think it absolutely makes sense that for the rest of your life you strive for safety in that sense, even if it's an illusion, right? Like for a country for your own. Now there are a couple of things, and I'm not qualifying that. So absolutely, I do understand this. But then, then we would have to talk about the Armenians, for example. And I mean, Holocaust is such a predicate that it's kind of, Israel has put a patent on it. It's ours. But today, and this is where you have to make the difference. So for the generation of your father, I completely understand it. But if we project the same image on today, what's happening today, then first of all, Israel is the most unsafe place on earth for Jews. There's no other place in the world where more Jews die than in Israel. But also the consequences. And I don't want to go into geopolitics yet. I just want to emphasize, so I completely understand your father's generation in terms of trying to create I think you said a safety net or something. So if something happens in Europe, you can also go back. I mean, this is not a new argument. This is an argument that has been offered many times and from different angles. But coming back to should we already go to today? Yeah? So on a personal level, so you said specifically Sabra and Shatila were kind of the turning point. And I had the fortune to talk to a number of people who had similar experiences. And when I say, what are those experiences? That means kind of transcending one's own point of view of the world. So for you, it would have been very easy to be completely in line with the mainstream narrative about Israel. Yeah? So I had a former member of AIPAC who later in life realized, then of course the Peled family, Miko Peled interviewed, his sister Nurit Peled El-Hanan, very, very interesting. She studied racism in Israeli school books, these kind of things. Emeritus Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, I think you might know him, American guy, very outspoken, coming back to security in Israel. Yeah? He said a statement, I've quoted it many times, but it's so true. He said, Zionism is burning Jews for fuel. But it's true. Yeah? Coming back to security in Israel and this kind of thing. So, jumping over your own rainbow. And sometimes I ask the question, so, and you answered it already, was this a gradual process, or was there a specific event that kind of triggered this kind of change in perspective? So for you, it was Sabra and Shatila, you said.
Well, I would say combined with other news stories and what was happening. We're talking about late 70s, early 80s. So we're talking about in the wake of the Vietnam War. So there's a general feeling amongst my generation that the West has discredited itself. It's committed appalling atrocities. There's a drift into nuclear war at this point. They're rearming, building more missiles, which makes me realize that whatever one thinks about Nazism, it's, which is, was a huge historical problem, that the regimes that were now stockpiling nuclear missiles, the Soviet regime and the Americans and British regime, which could have created a war at the time which would have destroyed the whole of humanity, far worse than anything that happened on its scale, than anything that happened in the Holocaust. Clearly there are other problems to deal with. This is also the time when the Americans, with some British backing and also actually Israeli involvement as well, are arming and supporting death squads in Guatemala, El Salvador, across Central America, committing appalling atrocities. So I'm making the obvious connections between Western democratic regimes supporting basically fascist regimes in the Third World, which are committing appalling atrocities, not on the scale of the Holocaust, but going very much in those directions. I mean, Argentina,
hundreds of thousands of dead. Yes,
exactly. In Central America, Argentina is a regime which is sort of has very strong Nazi ideas in it. It's actually picking on Jewish protesters more than others. My father's one of his friends has family in Latin America, i.e. a friend from the post-war refugee camps here in England, and he goes to live eventually in Argentina, has a son. The son gets caught up in left-wing activity, and the son is disappeared, and he's never to be seen again. So there's a realization for me in the early 80s or whatever that Nazi atrocities are not sort of outside of history. This is part of a problem of capitalism and, of course, what was called then, what some people call socialism, but with the state, this horribly repressive regime. Understand there's something wrong with the world that needs to be changed. My father doesn't have this sort of radical politics, but he's interested in it, and we discuss it. And I can understand why he wouldn't want to look at the world in that way, because after what he'd been through, the last thing he wanted to do is take on these bigger issues. But I very much felt this was my responsibility as the son of a Holocaust survivor to try to find ways to understand why the world has got into this state and how we can get out of it, which is a big project to take on, and I can't pretend I've got very far with it, but it's something that I feel motivated to do.
You make it almost sound like it's a logical consequence that that you stepped over your rainbow. I would say it's, and the numbers prove it, it's quite extraordinary. Yeah. So in overall numbers, it's a minority. Yeah, but you make it almost sound like it's a logical consequence of...
in my head, in my life,
yes.
It's a logical consequence, yes. But I know many sons and daughters of survivors who are not as political as I am, but there are many who are, and there are others who use their experience to become, for instance, doctors or to work in medicine, to help people in that way, or to charity. Obviously, other people will become strong supporters of Israel. They think that is the political solution as opposed to something like socialism or anti-war politics. There are many options as to what lessons one can learn from a particular tragedy. But obviously, in my head, I have a particular way of looking at things, which I think partly comes just of the culture of, if you like, late 70s, early 80s English music culture. The political culture of young people then was very politicized. It was a period of a lot of politicization. Then you had the miners' strike in this country in particular. So there was like a decade of you had to have political opinions as a young person. Didn't have to. Most people did in that period, late 70s, early 80s. Things are a little different now, I think.
Yeah, you jumped over the miners' strike. I mean, for people who do not know, it's probably worth noticing that Margaret Thatcher actually instructed, I think it was the army, right, to shoot on the miners.
Whether she did or it didn't happen, there was no shooting. I think the story is that soldiers were being dressed up as police officers because they ran out of the number of police in order to contain the strike. There was certainly a lot of violence on the police's side in that strike, and it was a massive defeat, not just for the miners but for the whole of the British working class. And Britain hasn't been the same ever since. This was a country which was based around industry, with a large industrial workforce, with some privileges isn't quite the right word, but there was a certain stability in life in communities, strong trade union movement, and this was completely destroyed. So we have the Britain today, which is finance capital, military. There is a lot of industry left, but nothing like on the scale of the past. A very different country. Yeah.
That, reflecting on Great Britain's past, and I know it's difficult, yeah, and seeing, we have India, Pakistan, Ireland, North Ireland, Israel, Palestine. What's the common denominator here? Well, Great Britain. And I'm not even talking about India or a famine and millions of starved Indians So seeing Britain's history, one would almost expect the British themselves to be more reflective in regards to history when they look at what's happening today in Gaza. But this is completely not the case. With exceptions like you and your group, of course.
What I think within academia, certainly within left-wing politics, within the wider intellectual culture in Britain, there is a lot of understanding of this. It might not be ideal, but there is. Within the political establishment and within the people who have the real power in any society, those with money, basically the very wealthy, and I suppose those at the higher levels of the military, the civil service, police and others, they march to the tune of the Americans, that they've made a decision over the decades, which they've reinforced since Brexit, which is that the British establishment goes along with whatever the Americans want. And so when it comes to the Middle East, you do what the Americans want. I don't think there clearly are, within the Foreign Office, attempts to think of things differently. But as I understand it, and even more so in recent years, any advice to have a different approach to the Middle East than the American line is ignored entirely, I presume, for economic reasons. And now that Trump is basically pushing that, you have to, you're either with us or against us to an actually extreme level. I'm assuming that's the way the British establishment intend to continue. I don't think they're even, the idea of learning from history, they made the decision in the 1940s to ally with the US, and they've never shifted from that. It's been a big issue in the Labour movement and the left in Britain, between those who went along with that, the right wing of the Labour Party, of which Keir Starmer, Tony Blair are in the tradition, and the left and others who wanted some kind of alternative. But the right wing of the Labour Party has just been endlessly ruthless against that side of things, and now basically expelled anyone from the Labour Party who has an anti-NATO or anti-US position.
And in that respect, Great Britain is not alone. Also, if you talk about Germany, America I make it again very black and white. America apparently blew up Nord Stream, which has led to the deindustrialization, and these are not my words, of Germany and by implication Europe. With a chancellor, I don't need to repeat the story here, standing next to Biden, we do everything together when they were talking about Nord Stream, these kind of things. So this complete strengthening of the NATO perspective, which is basically an indoctrination coming from the American side vis-a-vis the vassal states here in Europe. I think the only exception, what makes the relation between the US and Great Britain a bit different, is their history. A colony, America was a colony, etc., etc. So there's a stronger bond. And of course, I think Great Britain is the first in line when it comes to support the US. There were de Gaulle, for example, was quite critical of the US. Yeah, some other Germans. I just do some research in regards to some NATO exercises in the past. So there were annual NATO exercises, massive tens of thousands of soldiers participating against the perceived threat of Russia. And some of those NATO exercises went so far that the exercise chancellor of Germany and the exercise foreign minister of Germany stepped out when they realized that America in that scenario did not only plan to nuke Russia, but to nuke Germany, and not with one or two nukes, but with a large number of nukes, just to prevent the Russians coming in. Yeah, I would not be surprised if there are similar scenarios on the table today, which are so classified that basically no information whatsoever comes out. Yeah. So anyway, this is NATO. There is a stronger tendency for NATO to kind of maintain American hegemony, because this is what it is. I would like to plant a seed in the viewer's mind. I published a couple of things already in regards to NATO's cognitive warfare program, which has now added a sixth domain of warfare, and that's our minds, our brains. Yeah. I mean, these are not my words. This is from the original documents from NATO. Yeah. If anyone is interested, check it out. NATO's cognitive warfare program. I published many things about this. Yeah. That gives me a segue into the zooming out a little bit, the overall situation right now. So from a British perspective, and from the perspective of from your personal history with your father, if you look at the global situation at the moment and focusing on Israel, yeah, so there was an attack on Iran. I mean, this is the absolute best case scenario for Netanyahu. Yeah, he tried to draw America into a war against Iran for a very long time. When you discuss these kind of things, again, personal interest, when you discuss these kind of things with the group, and I know it's not a homogeneous block, yeah, of Holocaust survivors and the proximity, what's their view in regards to what clearly is an expansion of Israel into Lebanon, into Syria, Golan Heights, etc. Yeah, how is that perceived?
Well, we're more of an activist group in terms of going out there and campaigning for the Palestinians and trying to go against the media lies that the pro-Palestine movement is anti-Semitic, by making the case that, you know, a consistent person who from a Jewish or Holocaust background would be very much against what British policy is, rather than debating amongst ourselves our different views. But obviously those views have come up. I mean, we have. I think it's fair to say we all have different views depending on our political background. It's going back to what I said before. You know, your particular family background has a huge influence on you, but exactly how it influences you, whether political, not political, whether this particular variety of left-wing politics, that sort of, there was no consistency. There are people who are more, if you like, pro-Soviet, Orthodox, have that sort of background politically. There are people like myself with what I would call libertarian Marxist approach to things. There are other people with a more, for want of a better word, reformist approach to things. They would look at things more in terms of like this new attempt to have a Jeremy Corbyn party. And so I suppose one difference that might come up amongst us is some people might go along with the general attitude in the British peace movement, which is that we need to move towards a multipolar world. In other words, not a world in which America is trying to maintain hegemony across the Middle East and other areas, and that Britain shouldn't be allied with that. Instead, we should look to the United Nations, to Europe, create other forces in the world so we can balance, if you like, the different levels of power, China, Russia, Europe, and everywhere else. And then we'd have a world where there was less likelihood of war. Now, I'm not against that idea if it would work, but my suspicion is, from my reading of history, and others in our group perhaps might disagree, I don't know exactly, is that would make war just as likely. If you have a series of capitalist imperial powers all competing with each other, it makes war perhaps even more likely than having one hegemonic power that controls things. That doesn't, of course, mean that I ever support the idea of American imperialism and hegemony. Rather, it makes me think in order to stop war in the future, we need to get rid of the logic of capitalism, of competing blocks of power, competing over resources and land, and getting rid of the state system, or transcending the state system, transcending the capitalist system. And that's a much more radical political idea, which within our group of Holocaust survivors and descendants, we have not had time to discuss and debate. What the purpose would be, I'm not quite sure, in the sense that I think those are discussions which go beyond our circles or whatever. But for what it's worth, and I'm sure your audience know this, the traditions of radical socialist thinking have always had quite a significant Jewish input. Obviously, Karl Marx, Leon Trotsky, Emma Goldman, the famous American anarchist, and Noam Chomsky, we've already mentioned. This has always been, there's much more to the radical left than the Jewish aspect, but it has been a disproportionate part of what, and I very much feel part of that. But obviously, I think in the 21st century, if we're going to develop new ideas, if they're more than just Jewish Marxists and Jewish radicals, we need much, much more than that.
I'm asking because, and I know it was not always the case, especially after the 67 war that changed, but there is a geopolitical element in regards to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I know it's not a correct term, and Netanyahu calls it the Palestine-Israel conflict. Those are things that I notice as a linguist. But there is a geopolitical aspect to that. And Joe Biden said it when he was still sane. I think it was Joe Biden. Israel is an unthinkable supercarrier in the Middle East. And there was another statement, if we wouldn't have Israel, we would have to invent it. So this kind of things, yeah. So from that perspective, and for me that explains the absolute support of the Western governments, very often, despite a growing sentiment in their own populations against the support, the uncritical, unconditional support for Israel, which is still maintained. So there is this geopolitical aspect, which I think, again, I don't want to quote Chomsky too often, but I think it was him who said, no, Arafat said already, that we will not be the Red Indians, which is kind of a racist remark from Arafat anyway. Yeah, but it's the sentiment I've heard a couple of times that the Palestinians might face a similar fate as the native inhabitants of America, for example, because there is this geopolitical aspect which makes it, especially for America, a key item to maintain Israel where it is. And then we can talk about oil, but this is going beyond the discussion, I think, that we are having today.
Mm. Well, the way I understand it is it goes back to the original Iraq War, not the original Iraq War, the one in 2003, when the Americans had this fantasy they were going to literally occupy Iraq and maybe even other areas of the Middle East and restructure the region using American soldiers, amongst others. And
7 countries in 5 years, General Wesley Clark, that's what they wanted.
It failed, as far as I can see. They couldn't impose the regime they wanted in Iraq in quite the way they wanted it. They weren't completely defeated either, but it was, I think, they learnt a lesson, which they probably should have learnt a lot before that, which is you can't use American soldiers, even with European and British backup, to simply restructure a region directly. So in a sense, the Americans were defeated in the Iraq War, although they certainly managed to kill many, many people and cause huge amounts of destruction. I think some estimates say as many as 4 million people died, both in the Iraq War and the follow-on, the aftermath in the Syrian civil war, and what's happened in Yemen and in Afghanistan, of course, as well, and Pakistan, Libya, killing all over the region. But I don't think that was the original American plan. Their fantasy was to stabilize the whole region with development and American domination and not just simply destruction, but they ended up only managing destruction. Now that's functional for America in that it stopped perhaps the Chinese or someone else coming into the region, but it's not ideal. So my understanding is that in the past, maybe in the 70s, say, America could still have the option of invading using soldiers. It had the option of relying on Turkey. It had the option of the Shah of Iran and his regime there. And what's happened in those decades is that it's lost those options, although it still has sort of allies in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. I think these are unreliable allies to some extent, and they don't have large populations that are going to do much fighting for them either. They just buy the weapons, which I'm not sure they have much use for. So I think, in a sense, the horror we're seeing in the Middle East now, the extent to which Israel is given a free pass, is partly due to weakness of American power, and they don't have any other options other than to support this rather crazy state. So I could be wrong, but I don't see, despite the fantasies about the Gaza plan, I don't see this as the ideal in terms of American foreign policy planning. I think it's a fallback position because they can't afford sending troops. Trump's not going to send troops to the Middle East, I don't think. in large numbers in the way Bush did 20 or more years ago. So supporting Israel is in a sense their last hope, and letting Israel doing utterly crazy things, bombing the whole region, causing instability, is their best strategy. But I don't think it's necessarily a sign of strength. It's to some extent a sign of relative decline and weakness in American power. That doesn't make it any better for the people in the Middle East in terms of the suffering and the death, or the prospects for nuclear war in the future, or all sorts of other problems. But I think that's one way of looking at it. And I think that's sort of fundamental to what's happened in the world since the Vietnam War, which is that the Western populations are not going to put up with their soldiers dying in huge numbers anywhere in the world. I mean, I forget the numbers of British soldiers that died in Iraq, but it was in the small hundreds, and it was a huge issue in Britain. Tony Blair will never be forgiven for that. No matter how reactionary politics gets here, there's not going to be any enthusiasm for sending British troops, even less in Europe. And this is a big problem for the West. Now they can get around it with drones and other new forms of warfare, and maybe they'll get away with it. And of course they can get the Ukrainians to do the fighting for them when they want a war with Russia. So I'm not saying that things are necessarily good in the world because of that. But the American power is weakening. Donald Trump is the obvious example of that. It doesn't mean the world is any safer, though, which is why I do have disagreements with some people on the broader left in this country and elsewhere who think if America just backs off and let other countries sort of take more power and we all try and share the world better, that will lead to a more peaceful world. Well, it might do, and I hope they're right, but it also might lead to a kind of a pre-World War I scenario where you've got all these different powers struggling for hegemony, and we end up with of course it'd be far worse than World War I if a nuclear war happens with Russia, China, or wherever. What the answer is another question, but yes.
Yeah, I agree with you. We are on the precipice of a new era, I would say. I interviewed a young lady. She's living in Canada, Dr. Susan Jacob, also a linguist, and she called Trump the orange man in the White House. And I found this so fitting. When the clown goes into the palace, the clown doesn't become king, but the palace becomes the circuit. That's very true in my perspective, when I think about not only Trump, but this whole entourage that he has surrounded himself with. But that makes the situation also extremely unstable. And I think the one word that everybody agrees upon when talking about Trump is unpredictable. I think that's the one word. Now, I heard Trump talk about pushing also. I mean, we know about his plan for Gaza, the new Riviera in the Middle East, etc. And there were discussions about pushing the Palestinians into Jordan and Egypt. And that surprised me because, I mean, I've spoken with a number of high diplomats in Jordan, and they all confirmed, and it was prior to Trump voicing this, they all confirmed their concerns about exactly such a scenario. Now, specifically in regards to Jordan, that would be the end of the Hashemite regime. So the king of Jordan today would not only fall, he might lose his life. And in Egypt, the situation wouldn't be much different. Yeah. Nevertheless, and now I come to, before I give the microphone back to you, I interviewed Professor Omar Bartov, and he's a Holocaust expert, so to speak. And he told me there is a trajectory towards genocide. Yeah. The first is dehumanization. It's a classic concept, dehumanization. The second is ethnic cleansing. So both of these parameters we see already in Gaza, and to a lesser degree in the West Bank. And then he said, well, and if you can't get rid of them, you kill them. So dehumanization completely. Palestinian terrorists, and this is the last 40 years. Yeah. Ethnic cleansing we see both. I mean, clear can be in Gaza, with the systematic destruction of basically anything standing up there, and now also in the West Bank. Now that they cannot relocate the Palestinian population, so what's left?
Well, I hope what you're suggesting is not going to happen. I mean, there are reasons to say that it won't happen. It's certainly not the way that happened to Jews in World War II, is because we're thankfully at the moment not talking about a world war scenario. I think to massacre people on that scale would take that sort of war. Hopefully that's not going to happen in the Middle East. I mean, one of the motivations for the Nazis when they gassed and killed in other horrible ways so many Jewish people, wiped out the majority of Jews in Europe, was to free up food, because they wanted to break the British blockade, which was preventing food coming into Europe at the time. And they didn't want a repeat of what happened in World War I, which is there was a lot of hunger in Germany. Some claim hundreds of thousands of Germans starved both during and after World War I. And this was one of the motivations of the German Revolution, this uprising which stopped the war and also threatened, to have some kind of revolution. Well, it was sort of a mini revolution in Germany. And the Nazis were terrified of that. So feeding their own German population at the expense of Eastern Europe populations was hardwired into the whole Nazi project, and was one of the reasons why the Nazis were so determined to kill the Jews. They originally, I think, planned to kill tens of millions of Soviet, non-Jews and others, but they realized they just couldn't get away with that in the context that they would have had an uprising from everyone in the occupied territories in Eastern Europe at the time. It wouldn't have worked, but they could pick on particular targets. So they targeted the people they saw as the biggest threat to them at the time. That's Red Army prisoners of war. My father witnessed what happened to Red Army prisoners of war. I think back in Częstochowa, there was a field somewhere near the camp where he was, and they just put this whole bunch of Red Army soldiers who'd been captured earlier in the war, and they gave them some rotten cabbages to eat, and they just died of hunger and starve. They got dysentery and they died in huge numbers. And he'd seen the way the Nazis had treated Jews and others in those years, and he was shocked at how brutal the Nazis were to Red Army prisoners of war. And I think it's 2 or 3 million they killed. They were killing Russian prisoners of war, not Nazis, but in huge numbers before they were exterminating Jews in huge numbers. But when they moved when they wanted to free up food, it made sense to the Nazis to pick on this what they considered to be real threat, i.e. Red Army, communist prisoners of war, and then Jews who they imagined were all communists or somehow would foment communism. And this was their paranoia about any situation which might lead to a defeat of Germany in a world war and then a German revolution. This was the absolute paranoia of the Nazi regime. So the point I'm trying to make in a rather long way is that I don't think the Israeli regime or the West as a whole is simply going to exterminate large millions of Palestinians. That's not what they intend to do. What they intend to do is to destroy Palestinian society in Gaza in some desperate attempt to sort of make Israel secure. None of it makes any sense at any geopolitical level, I don't think, except for the fact they've got no one else to be their ally in the region. So they're, if you like, going along with the craziest fantasies of the Israeli right, because they're the only people crazy enough to fight in the Middle East and to risk everything. You can imagine if when they were bombing Iran, the Iranians were firing missiles, they were firing missiles not to Tel Aviv, but to London or Washington. People would be, what are you doing, creating a war in which we're at risk? But the Israelis will somehow put up with this madness because they believe in it and they feel very insecure, and they have all this Holocaust history that's pushed down their throat and distorted in so many ways. So I think there's a level of irrationality that we need to get to grips with in order to understand what's going on. The real problem is none of us in this room or in the United Nations or in the White House know what the plan is next, because there is no rational solution to this problem. Because, as you've hinted at, if they do kick out 1 million or so Palestinians to Egypt or Jordan or anywhere else, those regimes will probably collapse. And if there's one thing that the powers in the West know, is they don't want to have a repeat of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, this uprising that starts in Tunisia in 2011, or was it 2010? I'm forgetting now, but back roughly then, didn't just cause problems in Tunisia. It didn't just spread to Egypt and cause the overthrow of basically a revolution in Egypt. It spread to every country virtually in the Middle East. Even in Israel, there were various economic movements, and it caused destabilization there. And it then sparked Occupy movement from Hong Kong to America to London. The whole world had this sort of movement, this global left-wing movement, of which the Corbyn project, Bernie Sanders, are still a leftover from that. Now, although someone like Trump and Netanyahu at some level might have forgotten about that, I don't think all their advisors have forgotten about that. The one thing they know, they don't want to recreate another Arab Spring by sending 1 million Palestinians into other countries in that region. So they're just completely stuck. So I can't work out in my own head what they intend to do, and I'm not, maybe you have a better idea. I think it's because they don't know what they're doing. They're just stumbling from crisis to crisis. And so we're in this utter mess. Is there a genocide going on in Gaza? Well, yes. Has it slowed down a bit? I hope so. I think so. Is there a long-term plan? I don't think so. This is, and that's not good news. It's very, very scary.
I agree to some of your points. To some, I have a little bit of different view, because I think the ultimate aim for Israel is exactly what they have on their armies here, the Greater Israel. This is what they want to achieve. If they can achieve it this time around, maybe not. Yeah, but I think this is what they want. God promised it to them, whatever. Again, Noam Chomsky, they're going to blow up the whole world, but who cares? They have God on their side. Yeah.
But they need America on their side, and Germany and
Yes.
Britain, and they might not have that
Yes.
all the time. And that's the...
I agree. So there was a Gallup study not so long ago. The younger the people are, also the population in America, the less support for Israel, and the older they are, the more support for Israel. That means in a generation or so, the support for Israel in America could evaporate. Yeah. But a generation is too long for the people in Gaza right now, right? So solution, I have no clue. Yeah, but I am very concerned. Accidents may happen or whatever. Yeah, it's really hard to predict. But facts on the ground show that Israel is expanding, because I guarantee you one thing: the buffer zone that they already had in Syria, in front of which they have now another buffer zone. Yeah, they will never give back. The same is true in Lebanon. Yeah. So Israel is expanding, not to forget even Syria, right? I mean, Syria, there is this little complication with Turkey, yeah. But this is the aim, right? And with a right-wing government, I'm not even sure a right-wing government is the correct terminology for what we are seeing in Israel right now, which is supported. Now, there is a platform in Israel where Israelis go and have a look how their own government bombs Gaza. Yeah, it's a kind of holiday, I don't know, feeling up there to see. Yeah. So there is this kind of, we cannot completely neglect the fact that something might happen there. Yeah. Anyway, this is just my personal concerns in regards to the situation there, especially since I've been in the region, not in Israel, but in Jordan. Incidentally, the first time when the Iranian rockets flew over Jordan, I was there. And in the night we watched, friends of mine, on social media, the impact of those rockets. So I was early in the morning looking the news, the world news everywhere. I tell you what I saw then and what was in the news, there is a world in between. There were impacts in Israel. Again, I think Israel learned a lesson. Iran is a dangerous foe, right? In the coming weeks, months, I don't know. From your perspective, in regards to the media, and I think you already mentioned the BBC, yeah? Do you guys, your group, do you think you have any influence on the media? The reporting, when BBC is tricky, yeah? But overall here in the UK, when you hear this kind of altered or alternative news, however you call it, how do you react to that? Or are there any considerations in regards to how to counter it?
Well, what I've tried to do, and others in our group have tried to do, is to be very visible on pro-Palestinian protests, so that when the mainstream media cover them, they can't help but point out that there are not only Jewish protesters there, but also descendants and actual Holocaust survivors there.
Define being visible. I'm curious.
Well, we have a banner which says Holocaust survivors and descendants against the Gaza genocide, which has appeared, in the Daily Mail and in the Guardian and other places, and I think maybe Sky News. We've had a few interviews here, there, and everywhere. We've had a lot of interest from very mainstream journalists when they meet us on the ground and they want to talk. But it's quite clear this is not a story that the mainstream media, BBC, Sky News, particularly want to cover, except when they do, which is, again, very rare. I would have expected after 2 years that we would have had more coverage, but we clearly haven't had as much as I wanted, and we keep trying, just in the hope of getting through to people. The basic message was that these protests are not anti-Semitic. They include hundreds, many, in the big demos, thousands of Jews, that Jewish activists are leaders of many parts of the pro-Palestine and other wider anti-war movements, as they always have been. Certainly in London, the London left has always been very Jewish friendly and very involving lots of Jews. So for the establishment media to create this myth that the British left is somehow anti-Semitic and that the Jewish community as a whole is terrified of the left is such a fabrication, such a ridiculous invention. I have my differences with Jeremy Corbyn. We all do. All people on the left have differences about this, that, and the other. But the one thing I'm completely reassured about, in fact, one of the reasons I think I became interested in left-wing politics is because it's a very comfortable place for Jews to be. There are other sections of British society, certainly when I was young in the 80s, which would not necessarily be a particularly, football fans or the military or many other parts of the society were not very favourable to Jews. The left, especially in London and the southeast, was always very favourable to Jewish people and full of Jewish people. I mean, so the idea that it's somehow anti-Semitic was this incredible fabrication that came up when Corbyn, when it was already in the air, people were talking about it, but it never became something that was so promoted so hard by sections of the establishment and by the media until Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. And then it just spread and spread and spread because it was the one thing that the establishment could use against him that seemed to work. Calling him a communist who might have worked for the East German regime, which was the invented stories the Daily Mail came out with back, I think, in 2015-16. No one cared. they couldn't, it didn't work. But to accuse the left of being, they're a bunch of anti-Semites, because people understandably think of anti-Semitism as a horrible prejudice, and because people have some knowledge of the horrors of the Holocaust, it was a very powerful propaganda. And because they didn't let anyone, not even Jewish people, except on a very small scale, counter that propaganda, and to be unfair or fair to Corbyn, the situation, because Jeremy Corbyn didn't get good advice and didn't fight back well enough on it at all, it ended up being this absolute huge problem which helped discredit the left and weakened Corbyn's chance of winning that election back in 2019, if I've got my dates correct. It's been one of the most tragic things that's happened in British politics, and very bad for Jews in Britain. It's not a good thing to be associated with a very right-wing McCarthyite witch hunt.
We're going to come back to this in a second. So the conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is, of course, the wet dream of Netanyahu. He said it a couple of times. Yeah. So anti-Semitism is the same as anti-Zionism. Why? Because then you preempt any legitimate critic vis-a-vis the state of Israel. Clear. Yeah. But I'm not from the United Kingdom, and many of my viewers probably also not. And I know we could spend a whole interview just talking about Jerry Corbyn. Yeah. But could you encapsulate it in a couple of minutes? What that was really about? I mean, basically, they threw him out of even out of the party. So, what were the interests behind? Did they fail? Did they succeed? What was that really about, in a nutshell?
What was it really about? What was it really about? What it was really about is that it was functional. It worked. The idea that the radical left, the pro-Palestine left, is anti-Semitic has been an idea in the West, but certainly in British politics, especially student politics, since I was involved in student politics back in the 80s. And it was a way in which the Labour right could fight against the Marxists, now the more radical students, they were quite influential in student politics back in those days, is you couldn't really fight on more honest terms and say we disagree about this policy, that policy, because everyone was trying to be left-wing and having some progressive views. But if you call the radical left, the pro-Palestine left, a bunch of anti-Semites, that would make many students think, there is a problem with the radical left, and they could sort of stigmatize them. And so there was this sort of unholy alliance between the Union of Jewish Students, which might include people who saw themselves as being socialists, but mostly were just pro-Israel people. They would ally with the Labour Party within the student movement. This is from my period as a student back in the late 80s, and with certain Marxist factions who took this line that we should, in effect, support Israel and that the pro-Palestine left is anti-Semitic. And this would be a very important part of student politics back then. So I'm not answering your question in a short way. I'm sorry. I know you asked that. That kind of student politics, I must admit, I imagined would stay within student politics back then. What has happened is partly because it's kind of my generation who are now in charge in the Labour Party. They've taken that crude student politics of how you deal with the left to deal with Corbyn. And they've had tremendous success with it, partly because people are more sensitive to anti-Semitism now, perhaps, than they were even back then in the 1980s.
What made Corbyn so dangerous that they had to pull the stunt?
Because on the issue of foreign policy, you could never trust him that he might refuse to press the button, say, within a nuclear war. He might speak out against a particular policy. I think that was the reason they hated Corbyn so much. My guess is that in terms of economic policies, he might have compromised on so many areas, especially as we're seeing now the bond markets and others are just imposing austerity on Britain, whether the British government wanted or not. They might have been more relaxed about that, but I think within the military establishment, they might have let someone like John McDonnell or someone of another part of the radical left, but because Jeremy always had that anti-war tendency, although I think he did agree, if I recall correctly, when he was leader of the party, that he was going to not only keep nuclear weapons, but I think even to have new varieties of nuclear weapons. And he certainly wanted to stay within NATO. So he was always willing to compromise, but I don't think they could trust him 100%. So they had to do something to try to discredit him. And this was very, and it was already there because the people within the pro-Israel movement were already providing these arguments. But many people, certainly involved in the pro-Palestine movement, think this is all because of this excessive power of the pro-Israel lobby, which obviously does include a lot of Jewish people. And I still think that's an exaggeration. I think that's an exaggeration of what's going on. I think it's just functional for the British establishment, by which I mean the media, right-wing politicians, and others, the security establishment, to use this propaganda, and so they will use, if you like, the sections of the Jewish community that are very right-wing, the official establishment of the Jewish community. They'll ally with them and they'll use their arguments, and it'll make it appear as if that section of society, which is tiny, the Jewish community in Britain is very, very small, has all this influence. But I don't think it's really the case. It's that they're just using it because it's functional and because they can discredit the whole left as being a bunch of barbarians and anti-Semites, because the left in Britain is strengthened by the Muslim community and other immigrant and ethnic minority communities. And so they can create this idea that the left as a whole, including the Muslims, are a bunch of barbarians and anti-Semites. And they can, in a sense, use genuine, decent anti-racism as a way to stoke racism, if that sort of makes sense. I mean, if you want to stir up right-wing, anti-immigrant, racist sentiment in modern Britain today, there's a danger you'll be accused of being a racist, even a fascist. But people like Nigel Farage, or even the present government who are stirring up anti-immigrant hatred, can just say, no, we're not racists. We defend Jews against those anti-Semitic Muslims. So it's a perfect argument for splitting different communities from each other. Classic divide and rule. The British establishment have been doing it for years and years, and a perfect way. I don't think there was ever anyone who thought this is the best way to deal with Jeremy Corbyn back in 2015. I think the establishment were trying to find different ways to deal with him, and when one thing didn't work, they tried another thing, and this does seem to have works. That's the best way I can explain it. In a very long way, not the way you asked it, in a short way.
I spent an hour in the subway, I think you call it, coming.
Metro.
Metro.
We call it the underground here.
Okay,
Or
the underground.
The tube. The
Yes,
tube
the
is
tube.
English. It's
Yeah.
English. The London way. Yeah.
And the one thing that really struck me whilst I was observing the people is the diversity. Yeah, there was a lady sitting behind me. Suddenly her phone goes up. It's an Indian sing-song. Yeah, you have all colors. You have, on the looks of it, it's really diverse. And at least in the metro, harmonious. Yeah, I didn't see any kind of whatever. Yeah. So how does that fact translate into the British foreign policy vis-a-vis, let's say, Gaza?
It's a big problem for the establishment because there is huge sympathy for people in Gaza and indeed for many other people who are attacked and bombed by Western countries, by Britain in particular. In Britain, the major cities in Britain have this very healthy, fast, amazing ethnic mix, which someone from a Jewish background, I just love it. And generally speaking, everyone gets on, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or whatever. That is the nature of British society today. It's absolutely fantastic. And this is why the extreme right, if you like, who are now getting more popular in Britain, need to find new and cleverer ways of manipulating people. And obviously, yes, accusing immigrants of being anti-Semitic as if they're defending one ethnic minority against another is very effective for them. And also for the media and other establishments, they can't criticize the pro-Palestine protests for being against war. They can't criticize us for they can't simply stir up English nationalism. We're the master race, we're superior, we have a right to bomb wherever we want. They can't use the argument, which of course was very popular when I was a young man, which is that we're a bunch of communists, we're subversive, and we're trying to destroy society, and we want to impose a kind of horrible, nightmarish dictatorship like there is in the Soviet Union. These were very powerful arguments to stop people getting involved in the left and the anti-war movement in the 1980s. So accusing the pro-Palestine movement of being anti-Semitic, and in particular using, if you like, the support for anti-racist legislation as a way of targeting the pro-Palestine movement, saying, you can't demonstrate because you're going to upset or scare or intimidate Jewish people. And so the repression can be like anti-racist repression, if that makes any sense. This is very functional for the establishment, both the right wing of the Labour and the Tories and the BBC and others. But it's taken to such unbelievably absurd extremes. I mean, the one example is because there is a synagogue, quite a relatively small synagogue, in an alley, in a street, some distance, but just round the corner from the BBC headquarters. When there was going to be demonstrations going from the BBC headquarters to Parliament, they decided to ban those demonstrations on Saturdays because there was a service of Jewish people round the corner, and the rabbi at that service said that from the river to the sea is an anti-Semitic slogan, or words to that effect, because he considered it to be, genocide. They want to kill all the Jews. That's what from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, it means. And they used that as an excuse to ban those demonstrations, even though those demonstrations were full of Jews, even though there was never any threat at all to the synagogue. No one was ever attacked or threatened or anything, nothing. There was no evidence. The police came out with nothing. And yet still they managed to ban the demonstrations. So they want to ban the demonstrations. They want to repress the movement against Britain's involvement in this war. And they have to come up with an excuse. And the anti-Semitism excuse works every single time. And those of us of a Jewish background go on these demonstrations. Partly we're so motivated to prove to people who see us that whatever else these demonstrations are, they're not anti-Semitic. I mean, anyone who goes there being openly Jewish is welcomed, is hugged, is cheered. It's the friendship, the warmth of the way we're received is just staggering. And it's not just us as Holocaust survivor descendants with our placards saying who we are, it's other Jewish people as well. There's never the slightest anti-Semitism at these demonstrations. and yet the media still portray it in that way. But this is why I think we're not covered in the mainstream media as much as I hope we would be, because it just goes against their whole narrative. They can't even believe what's happening. And it's a very strange phenomenon. It just shows that there are people within the establishment media who are living in their own world, if you like. To be fair to the journalists at a lower level, I think they know what's going on once they meet on the streets, but their bosses and the people at a higher level, and well, we see it now. Because they said something about Donald Trump, the BBC are now in huge trouble, and several of their leaders have now had to resign. And you're thinking, well, what's left of the mainstream media in this country? It does what Donald Trump wants it to do.
That was a bit questionable to montage, an event in a way that portrays, the contrary of what actually was said. So that's a bit tricky. Yeah? I was just surprised because, they do this for years. Yeah. And anyway, very briefly, from the river to the sea. This is a slogan that is written in the charter of the Likud party, right? So I'm always surprised if a rabbi also mentions this because the background here. But because you mentioned a demonstration, so coming Saturday there is a large demonstration here in London. In the past, I have seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, so I heard different numbers, but there were demonstrations up to 1 million people here in London not so long ago. Is that correct?
I mean, whether we had one single demonstration as big as 1 million, I'm not so sure. But if you add up all the hundreds of thousands who've come on series of many 30 or more demonstrations, it's certainly well over 1 million people have demonstrated in this country against the war.
So, I saw images from a drone. The whole center of London was packed with people in all directions. That's what I saw, yeah. So, and of course, the global media hardly covered it, right? I saw this on so-called alternative media, right? So what's your prediction for coming Saturday? What, 29th, 30th, what is it, 29th, 30th, November. So what's your prediction here?
Well, we'll have huge turnout and the media will not cover it very much, as we've had on many other occasions. The hope, I suppose, is that the amount of social media coverage will be such, and of course people in London will see the demonstrations are here, that eventually it'll sort of filter out into the wider society.
What's your role?
I've never seen anything quite like it, the extent to which there was a huge protest movement, which isn't completely ignored by the mainstream media, but the extent to which it is sort of semi-marginalized. It's not the Soviet Union, they don't just pretend it didn't happen at all, but they really do downplay it. My role is the role of us Holocaust survivor descendants, is to make it very clear that many of us with that particular background are heartbroken about what is happening in Gaza, have total empathy with the people suffering in Gaza today, and are completely against the way in which Israel, and particularly its supporters, its armors in the British establishment here, will justify what they're doing on the basis that we must arm Israel to defend Israel in order to prevent a further Holocaust. In other words, to use the suffering of Jews to justify the suffering of Jews, which was, of course, an unbelievably appalling genocide in World War II, to use that genocide to justify their support for another genocide. There is nothing greater, more of an insult to the memory of the Holocaust than to use that history, that memory, that appalling tragedy to justify more genocides. And that is what the British establishment have completely signed up for at the moment. And we need to do all we can to counter it. And even if we're completely ignored by the BBC forever, we'll keep protesting, because what else can we do? We have now this bizarre scenario where sometime next year they're going to start building a Holocaust memorial right next to the Houses of Parliament, a very large Holocaust memorial, which would be fine if it was a memorial to all genocides, but it isn't. It's very clearly going to be a memorial that prioritizes the Holocaust. It will mention some other genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda and elsewhere, but it's specifically, as I understand it, not going to mention anything about Palestine, and it's obviously not going to mention the British Empire's involvement in all sorts of atrocities and massacres and horrors over the centuries, the killings of Hindus and Muslims and the Africans, and the slave trade and all these other horrors. And it's surely only by understanding the Jewish Holocaust in the context of bigger history that you can even begin to understand it. and to have a monument, there were no other monuments next to the Houses of Parliament of that size. To have a monument that prioritizes only this particular horror, which was every bit as bad as we know it was, absolutely terrible, but to prioritize that particular historical event, which of course didn't happen in these islands and wasn't the direct responsibility of Britain, to prioritize that atrocity over every other atrocity that's happened in history, including all the ones that Britain was responsible for in Ireland, India, and elsewhere, is the classic British technique of divide and rule. We will support and empathize with and talk about all the time the suffering of Jews all those years ago, but we won't talk about other suffering. And in terms of trying to split the Jewish community from other ethnic minorities in Britain, I mean, it's so cynical, it's so manipulative, and it's difficult to criticize, because you say, I'm against the Holocaust memorial, makes you sound like some kind of Nazi, which of course I'm not. And I'm all in favor of memorialization and especially historical understanding of that period of history, but it has to be in the context of all the other people who were killed in World War II and in the wider context of imperialism and war, and, much bigger things, and certainly in the context of the British Empire. If it was my choice as to what sort of monuments there should be next to the Houses of Parliament in Britain, obviously a monument to slavery, which Britain was responsible for, the slave trade, would be the priority, and other horrors of the British Empire. That's what Germany, as I understand it, was done. They've got a memorial to the Holocaust in Berlin. They don't have a memorial to the crimes of the Americans in the US killing Native Americans or some other atrocity. It makes absolutely no sense, but it's very difficult to criticize. It's only because I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor that I have even the confidence to criticize it. And it isn't just me that's criticizing it. There are Holocaust historians have criticized this monument, because although it has some small spaces in it for educational purposes to teach children and others about the history, they're far too small. They're like the one we're in now, apparently. They're going to be completely if you want to do a decent Holocaust memorial, you put it in another part of the country where you can have big rooms and teach rooms, lecture theatres and such. It's not. So it's a big monument, but it's not suitable at all for educational. It's just propaganda of, in my opinion, the most cynical sort.
Mark, very fitting words to conclude this interview. But before we do, I mean, I know we covered quite some space. Is there anything that's close to your heart that we have not scratched on?
Well, I think what we have scratched on it, because we mentioned the Arab Spring. I think one of the problems with being obsessed with the worst horrors in human history, and of what's not just history, what's happening now, the genocide in Gaza, is it tends to get rather negative and demoralized. And I think that's what the establishment want. They're quite happy with us being depressed and unmotivated. And it's always been important to me to look at moments in history when things are getting much better, when there was a real hope of improvement. And we've already talked about the Arab Spring, and this was something that came as a huge surprise to me. I don't know, perhaps to you as well. No one expected it. There was this the 2008 crash, austerity all over the world. No one quite knew how to fight back. And then suddenly, of all people in the Arab world were rising up, overthrowing regimes and inspiring this movement right across the planet. So that was a very optimistic time, even in what appeared to be a very pessimistic time in the wake of the 2008 crash. And I think to understand, going back to the Holocaust, I don't think it'll ever be taught in Holocaust memorials or even in many universities in Britain today. But the way I like to understand the Holocaust is, no, not really in a positive light, but okay, I'll try and make my point. My understanding of the Holocaust and the horrors of the World War II, they were the pinnacle of a counter-revolution. They were the pinnacle of the destruction of the hopes of the European socialist and other movements in the months and years before World War I especially, and certainly then the Russian Revolution itself. So if you look in Britain in 1914, you have a very large working class movement, unprecedented in this country, increasingly strong Labour Party, trade unions, massive strike wave. There'd been a huge strike wave in 2011, in 1911 earlier. There was also the beginnings of some sort of uprising in Northern Ireland, a real threat to their domination of Ireland and other parts of the empire. And there was a very militant feminist movement calling for the right to vote. And the thing the establishment were most scared of here was those movements coming together. And I think that's one of the motivations why they were so keen and quite happy to go to war. Because Britain didn't really need to get involved in the First World War, but it wanted to, partly because it would stir up nationalism and it would contain all those, if all that energy, that anger that was coming often from young workers was then expressed instead in terms of nationalism, in terms of supporting war, that's a way of containing those forces. And it wasn't just in Britain. I think the same, to an even greater extent, was happening in Germany and Russia and elsewhere. So there was this mood at the beginning of the 20th century for real social change across the world, and driving the world into war wasn't the only cause of the First World War, but was one of the causes. And then, of course, the big problem with that is it's great while you're winning a war or while you're fighting the war, but once you get defeated, then you have revolutions. You have the revolution in Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is overthrown. You have, of course, the Russian Revolution, and really revolutionary movements in France, Britain, and elsewhere. And that is all, if you like, contained by war. It doesn't go away. There still are radical movements in the West. The French Popular Front, there are strikes in America, other things going on. And so World War II comes in, and obviously there's a real threat in Germany of a revolution in the wake of the economic crisis in the late 20s, early 30s. And so war, if you like, and the Nazi regime and war itself in particular, is the way of containing all those pressures. And so you get a massacre of the left. Stalin's regime, the Nazi regime, kill hundreds of thousands of people who were associated with the left. And so the Holocaust, if you like, is the pinnacle of that massive counter-revolution. And so the point I'm trying to make in a very long-winded way is even the worst parts of human history, there's hope somewhere. If you dig deep into that history enough, you really see there was the real hope for a world without war, without, perhaps even without state, certainly without racism, without massacres, without genocide. It was the beginnings of that was there at the beginning of the 20th century. It was contained by the atrocities, the horrors of the war. And that can demoralize us, but I think it can also give us hope that perhaps if we could create some kind of global uprising on the scale of what was happening around that time, say the time of the Russian Revolution, that now nothing could stop us, because the level of poverty, the level of wealth, the level of education in society now is completely different from what it was back then. So if we did have something like a global uprising on that scale, if you like, an Arab Spring times 100 times 1,000, I think there is a real potential for a social transformation which could get us out of this mess entirely. So my hope is that might sound extreme, it might not convince too many people, but if you look at history in the big scale, it's only through revolutions, whether you go back to, say, the English Civil War, the English Revolution, or the French Revolution, or the Russian Revolution, it's these big social upheavals which lead to real permanent change in society, a qualitative change of how society is organized. I don't think we're going to be able to make the changes we need in society simply by voting for politicians in Parliament who simply reform things away. Many of my friends, including my Holocaust survivor descendant friends, disagree, and we argue about such things. But I think we shouldn't get too disillusioned, because although things are looking pretty terrible in the world at the moment, 2011, the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement wasn't that long ago, and the various other world-changing uprisings, not just, of course, what was happening in the period of the Russian Revolution, but in May '68, there was an explosion that took place. Student movement, workers' protests, other anti-war movements, all over the world. The whole world was turned upside down. And for most of the past 100 years, it's been almost, or for centuries, unimaginable. A world revolution, how will that ever happen? Well, we now know world revolution is the easiest thing. The easiest thing is having a protest that then spreads around the world. That's with social media and the way in which we're all interconnected, that's the easy. The thing is, we need to have the uprising in the first place that it leads to that. And if an uprising in Tunisia, of all places, which I've never been to, can lead to a world uprising, as it did in 2011, I think we have to look for somewhere in the world now where that's going to happen, which will inspire us all. Where it's going to be, who knows, no one can predict. But I despite the grim times we live through, Gaza, genocide, I mean, it couldn't be worse. I'm still hopeful.
I hope the viewers share this hope, because it's really important, to remain hopeful. Without hope, there is no future.
Well, can I just, the point I should have made, because this is relevant to my father's. My father survived the war, not just through his personal, luck. Mostly it was just luck. Mostly it was just, you have a certain strength when you're that age. But he had this he just kept going, one foot in front of the other at a death march or whatever. And I don't have his physical, maybe I'm sure even his emotional strength, but I do fantasize that I do have some of that stubborn, you just have that stubborn quality that actually does happen. Many Holocaust survivors I've met, there's that stuff. You just keep going. You look at the light and the hope in the future, even if everything is bleak and you think it's absolutely hopeless, you just keep going. And I think all humans have that. You just look at the people in Gaza. I mean, my God, the optimism they managed to maintain despite all the horror and the death and destruction that's going on all around them, and that gives us a chance. We will win one day, I hope, and we have no choice. That's it. There is no alternative. We can't give up, so we've just got to keep going.
On that note, Mark, it was my pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your time.